I want to talk to you about everything: remote viewing, 5G.
Also with my mother, when she died of encephalitis, swelling of the brain, which happens quite often with alcoholics, so instead of cirrhosis of the liver, there's a big majority that it's swelling on the brain. And like, you know, when a child gets in a car accident, or if I got in a car accident, my brain would swell to protect it, right? And then as I'm healing, the swelling in the brain would go down, and then, you know, I could function again with my brain. So what I realized with my mother that I'd never known, and I wish I had known, is during the last 10 years of her life, that brain swelling settled in. And with alcoholism, brain swelling never goes away, right? And then number two, the frontal lobe cortex, just like a person with mental illness, that begins to happen with people with addiction. I'm also wondering if you've heard this, because here I am my whole life, you know, and a child of an alcoholic, and I didn't realize in her last 10 years, and I wish I'd known this, and it's my fault, but literally it wasn't in any of the codependent books, anything I read about children of alcoholics and things like that. If someone had given me the information, all these psychological books, my therapist, right? Why didn't anyone ever tell me my mom's brain? And maybe they did at the right time. Maybe it was good for me not to know this, but I don't know. Those last 10, 20 years of my mom's life, had I known it was shrouded with the frontal lobe cortex changing just like a mentally ill person, that would have been helpful, number one. And to know the science of it, like, and hey, this is irreversible. And like, because all of us were trying to still go to my mother with logical solutions and not realizing, I mean, yes, we knew her brain was pickled, right? But what does that mean? Anyway, and then add on another layer where they're saying, not only that, but they're emoting hormones that make you not feel good. Anyway, do people know this? And let me ask you, did you know all of that? And like, yeah, why aren't these things known? It would make life easier. So anyway, just wondering your thoughts on all of that.
Laura, I think you brought up a really incredible example of whether or not, the question I have is whether or not your mother already suffered from cerebral syphilitic meningitis, which sometimes can be another reclassified name for the polio. By the way, yes, a lot of people think that vaccines somehow treated polio, but it was just reclassified, as is, you know, all these new developments of neurological and immune conditions that have somehow made their way into society over the last several decades. But anyhow, so the question is whether or not she suffered from this, and she was doing everything she could to cope with the pain and trying to anesthetize the pain, and whether or not maybe the addiction, it caused the inflammation to magnify, or, you know, was that the reason she developed it? And, you know, unfortunately, when it's not treated, this kind of brings up a really important topic that I believe is one of the most important issues that we can address. And it's to unfortunately overcome the repeat patterns, whether it's from trauma, past conditionings. It all boils down to one particular method, and it is knowing healthy coping behaviors. Because when we lack the proper adaptive coping strategies or the right resources that we have available, unfortunately, we feel denied of those ideal solutions, which will only prolong those core challenges. And that's when it will lead to a host or multitude of different long-term, you know, probabilities, such as escaping to addiction or codependency, to try to remove the pain, trying to escape the pain, right? Or we can even escape to procrastination, and, you know, a host of other things that we are addicted to. It could be to even relationships or shopping, electronics, food, you name it, right? So I think the how of healthy coping solutions is really what's most important when we're working at the subconscious level. And that, causes the repeat patterns until we recode the pattern. And, we can use the core psychotherapy techniques. For example, if we can decode the problem first, whether we're just getting to the truth, writing out the fear or the pain point that's related to the problem. So with your mother, for instance, she may have already been suffering this health condition. She may have been suffering something, and oftentimes there's something epigenetic because it's in the DNA, right, on a genetic level, which is why we really need to get to the core and get to the epigenetics of the epigenetic expression. Sometimes that can also begin to develop and evolve into a parent-child pattern and repeat throughout our life. Anyway, so we can go into some steps around this, but I think the most important step to adaptive coping responses is outlining first and foremost the shame and remove the guilt that continues to keep us stuck or prevent us from advancing successfully. Because once we can heal the belief programs that are causing the shame and guilt, for instance, it could be, mother may have believed her only worth was tied to codependency in a relationship with a man. And therefore, that same belief pattern was conditioned in her daughters. And, that might continue to create shame if a daughter doesn't believe her worth is entirely intrinsic and it's not tied to anything outside of her, to relationship status. So anyway, there's so many different techniques, but once we can really center around working through the guilt and shame and the belief program, it will help us to neutralize the emotional charge. And we can use that with powerful perceptual reframing techniques, and then focus on how we can take accountability, knowing the DNA is not our responsibility, but how do we want to be the change we wish to see so that we can be more empowered and gain more gratitude and confidence. And then it can help us also have compassion and understanding for maybe a parent that if we did resent the parent, we recognize now we're wearing their shoes in the world a little bit, because we can understand the same epigenetic expression, which shows up a lot in our psychology. Anyway, and then we can continue to move through different steps that helps to alchemize, all of it. And I just think that that's such a good example. And I know I went into a lengthy tangent around that, but I think that is so important, because if we're not working with adaptive healthy coping responses, we're turning to the problem that continues to recycle, and we're just going in circles throughout our whole life until we recognize we don't want to repeat the painful patterns anymore. And that can be related to health or career and finance. There's so many other areas where we might notice those patterns, whether they're epigenetic or not. I do find that is the common denominator with every client that I've worked with, including myself. That is the second step, the most important of the panacea. I mean, there's several, each and every one of them are important, but that is the most common one that is missed if we don't at least button up and polish that particular step. We often won't successfully advance to the next stage of our life. So I think that one's always a really good one to spend some very thorough time with and ensure that we can move forward to the next step and recode the pattern or even repattern the programming. So I'm just kind of curious what you're experiencing in relation to that with your mother, and how is that impacting you?
So regarding, how does it impact me with my mother? That's a good question. When I was in a space where I was broken open and kind of able to view this whole thing that was part of my identity or my story with my mother, the child of an alcoholic, repeating patterns, repeating codependent behavior, like you're saying. And thank you for showing, the repeating patterns, but it's exactly that. I can see in some family history books that from Sweden, both my grandparents came here, wrote books about their family, and my grandfather was an alcoholic, so my mom's dad. And yes, my grandmother, she expressed if she could have gotten a divorce in the 50s, She would have, but nobody did then. The family nucleus stayed together, I guess. And so what resulted was dysfunction, which is fine. But I too was curious, like, when did this all start? This alcoholism that's just passed on. And of course, we children wanted to be the generation that broke that addictive pattern cycle. And I think very distinctly, I would come to that question in meditation on my own was exactly that. I would say, where does this quote unquote anxiety stem from? What can I name this anxiety? What is it? What needs to surface? And then, of course, what resulted was 5 years of letting, and we've discussed this before, what is anxiety? How does it manifest? What was it from? But when I started asking those questions in meditation, it very specifically linked me to, you need to heal and ask questions about the line of your mother. So I did. I mean, rather than kind of shelve it, maybe, which I did most of my life, or it was just so traumatic. But even whilst she had her addiction, quote unquote, from alcoholism, it wasn't an everyday thing. It was more binges and cycling on. I mean, she'd go 6 months, whatever. And then we had a discussion when I was in high school. I watched a movie on quote unquote anxiety and how that's what stems most alcoholics or addicts, to medicate that. And then I was like, well, what's anxiety? Even then, and talking to my mom, and she was like, well, a lot of people believe you go through this 12-step program, which she never liked, by the way. But she did like and understand the concept, I think, that Carl Jung initially brought up, of community, what is lacking. But she definitely, in discussion, always said there's something. Yeah, she didn't feel mentally okay, thus she drank. And that is exactly shame and guilt, of course, that was the root. And even when I started going deeper underneath anxiety in meditation, and, since then with you and other people, is let's go underneath anxiety. And every time I asked, it said, go to the root. And then the root is the family, right? And it's my mom. And I will have to say, now I can name when I start feeling that angst or anxiety. I can feel it in other people. And yeah, I guess that's what I want to talk about, is that process of surfacing it. Because I think what you and I do a really good job, or what we could, is the exact process and tools and techniques, right, of how we did it, or what happened, what helps our clients. And for me, it's a lot of those questions, and like you're saying, looking at what is it, was it shame, guilt? Yes. And then going underneath that with the panacea process, like you say. But yeah, I love this marriage and blending of, finding the medicine that is the healing, and I think it's from within. So thank you. We're just providing that missing link, that bridge between the Western solutions, which are a program and not real healing or medicine. So I just love the approach that you took, which was, of course, epigenetics. Nobody has explained things, and like I said, I haven't found books on this. So thank you for being my go-to book person.